Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. We appreciate all the messages we get, all the support we're getting. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you can check us out on many fine podcast platforms. Take us wherever you want to go and listen to us in the car, when you're out on a walk or what have you. If you're listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms, please check out our YouTube page. And as always, leave a like, subscribe, leave a review, but most importantly, let your friends know and your family members know and your family members' friends know. Let them all know that you're enjoying the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour. Without further ado, I want to bring on our guest. Very excited to bring her on. We've been having this conversation, a continuing conversation about the Bayh-Dole Act and innovation. Joining me today is Kate Hudson. She has served at the Association of American Universities since March of 2022. As Deputy Vice President and Counsel for Government Relations and Public Policy. Kate assists in managing and directing the Government Relations and Public Policy Department and developing and executing strategies to advance AAU's advocacy and public policy priorities in the federal legislative and regulatory arenas. Prior to joining AAU, she served in the federal government as a senior attorney advisor in the legislative and executive branches, most recently with the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the GAO. An active volunteer, Kate is a member of the Military Spouse JD Network, the Women's Bar Association of the District of Columbia, and Women in Government Relations. She holds a master's in public administration, I do as well, Kate, and public policy from American University, a law degree from the University of Dayton School of Law, and both a master's and bachelor's degree in political science from Ohio University. Kate, thank you so very much for joining us today. I should have said the Ohio University, right? Isn't that how they say it?
Well, that's Ohio State, but my diploma also says the Ohio University on it.
There you go. Sorry, yes, I get to say not being from Ohio. All I know about Ohio is that it's high in the middle and round at the end. So you're going to have to forgive me there. So let's talk about this, and let's just get into talk about the Association of American Universities and the work that you do there.
Yeah, great. So the Association of American Universities is comprised of 69 U.S. and 2 Canadian top-level R1 research universities. These are both public and private and some public flagship universities as well, present in 31 states across the country, spanning environments of both urban campuses and rural campuses. These universities represent the big players in federal research dollar funding, as well as a lot of the innovation and technology transfer that is coming off of university campuses. AAU is 124 years old, so wow. we are not new to this game. We have a long history in this space, both in terms of higher education and research university issues across the spectrum. Everything from taxes and endowments to higher education, Title IX, campus speech, NSF and science funding. We touch a number of issues across the spectrum, and I get to represent these great members every day here in Washington.
That's terrific. And so what classifies a research institution as an R1 research institution?
Yes. So there is something called the Carnegie classification scale, and that groups universities by a number of metrics. There are actually quite a few metrics that go into the classification scale itself. Most notably, how many PhDs are being granted in the sciences, and how much research funding is secured by faculty and graduate students on campus, as well as the diversity of programs available in a myriad of fields. So that's a very broad brushstroke part of it.
Sure.
But in terms of the classification, it is those metrics all the way up and down the scale. There are a number of R1s in the United States. I believe that we're somewhere in the landmark of 170 to 175 R1 research institutions, but we also have a host of R2 and R3s in the United States.
Got it. And let me get into this here, because so we had a conversation back not you and me, but you and I had a conversation just a couple weeks ago. But we had we on the show had a conversation about 6 months ago with David Kapos, who I know you know. He had been the head of the Patent and Trademark Office under President Obama, under Secretary of Commerce, now heading the IP practice at Cravath, Swaine and Moore. And we're talking about Bayh-Dole. And he was talking about the importance of, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but the importance of Bayh-Dole to universities like the ones that you represent. And actually universities at all levels, R1, R2, and R3. Yes. He was talking about historically black colleges and universities, the HBCUs. Mm-hmm. And actually, let me pivot to something else, which is earlier this week on the radio, I was echoing the words of your colleague, Joe Allen, who we've also had on the show. This idea that innovation does not happen in a vacuum. It doesn't just sort of magically appear. Talk about that from the standpoint of the institutions that AAU represents.
Absolutely. So my member institutions represent the key components of the academic research enterprise that contribute to that innovation ecosystem that we have in the United States. And so everything from the fundamental research that is happening on my campus to the licensing of nascent and embryonic discoveries and technologies that are made on my campus labs that move through the further research and development process, hopefully to commercialization. Sure. And then dissemination to the market or otherwise, or just to inform future research and to be built upon by others in their field as well. And that takes, a myriad of forms, both in the fundamental research that we do, that then there are publications or potentially patents that come out of that research. And then all the way through that development with our private and nonprofit and startup partners to bring those discoveries and further develop what those discoveries could actually look like. And this spans all sectors. This is not just in one sector. Right. Universities do research in a wide array of research topics and subjects. And sometimes we discover something in one field, but it's actually applicable in another. So there's this great cross-pollination as well. And so our members specifically are powerhouses of that innovation and that economic development that is coming off of university campuses. Our research institutions also are the workforce development component of that as well. They're obviously all of higher education is preparing the workforce of tomorrow, but specifically in a lot of those hard science and research and emerging and critical technology fields. My members specifically are the universities that are producing the graduates that will work in those next generation and those critical and emerging technology fields now and into the future.
Listen, it was one of the greatest, happiest moments of my life. I spent a couple of years teaching on regulatory policy at a major university, and the emphasis was on getting kids prepared, students, I should say, students prepared, young adults prepared for doing serious analytical work in the regulatory field. And I was happy to be a part of that, sort of putting out a curriculum that could do just that. So I get this. So let's set the Wayback Machine. And we've gotten, obviously we've gotten perspectives from David Kapos and Joe Allen on this. What was the briefing that I attended in which you spoke, it's very clear folks look to you for your expertise on this as well. Let's talk about the ecosystem pre-Bayh-Dole, right? We think about the Apollo moon missions and the concerted effort that was done there. There was a goal that was set by President Kennedy, later taken on by President Johnson, later President Nixon, to get men on the moon and returned within a 10-year time frame. Tremendous effort there. Joe talked about sort of the CIA briefing that he'd gotten in which America was in danger of losing on innovation. So let's talk about the university component there. What was happening? What needed to change? Why was innovation languishing prior to 1980?
Absolutely. So the research that was being performed on university campuses under federal research funding, the outcomes of that research There was obviously publications of research findings if they were significant and making a contribution to that field. But discoveries that were made with federal funding, the patents that were derived from that research, they were centralized here in Washington, D.C. They went back to the agency that had funded that research grant in the first place, right? It just came back to D.C., kind of sat on a shelf, to be honest. It's kind of, like any one of those Indiana Jones movies where they just file it away in a warehouse, right? And put it away. And they were basically sitting on a shelf. They were available for, agencies or other government actors to try to develop and potentially commercialize. But that in actuality didn't happen, right?
Sure.
That's not what was happening. And market forces and economic incentives don't really work that way, right? You need to have that exclusivity. You couldn't have like a non-exclusive license where the government could just give it to somebody else as well after you've done all of that work, right? And so the Bayh-Dole Act was really necessary to change those conditions and to put the intellectual property itself back into the hands of the researchers and the universities that were performing the research themselves, and to allow universities to work with private sector partners to develop and license those technologies and those research developments. But before 1980, those, a myriad of patents were just languishing, just sitting there undeveloped. Not a single drug was developed from an NIH grant before that.
Wow.
They were more or less just hanging out, sitting there dormant, not really contributing anything to the build of that innovation in those scientific fields, other than the publications themselves.
So let me ask you this, because I want to get into it, and remind me if I get astray here, because I want to get into the impact on the student population and the sort of the right, because there are two ecosystems we're talking about. There's the ecosystem of the innovations themselves, but then there is the ecosystem of the universe of innovators, like the folks who are doing this research, and the two go hand in hand. And we spend a lot of time focusing on the innovations themselves and not a lot of time focusing on the next generation, creating the next successive generations of innovators. But before we get to that, let's talk about how monies were given out before, and why is this money, why is federal grant money so important in an era where you get folks who are engaging in research and education, the concept of the venture capital, but talk about why the federal money is so important at the embryonic stage.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the federal research dollars that go from funding agencies to universities or other nonprofits to perform that research, that is what we call fundamental research. These are your basic level research into a whole host of fields that the private sector is not going to do, right? There is incredible risk. It's also at a level that the private sector is not willing or equipped to support, right? So research into the fundamental laws of physics, right? Boeing is not necessarily going to fund endless research funding into what the actual tenets of the laws of physics are, right? They're happy to draw on the research that is performed at universities in this space, but fundamental research that's performed on the campuses is of the nature that is not supported by any other sector in the U.S. economy. And that is also true, and that's also true globally, right? A lot of fundamental research happens on campuses across the globe. And so it's so important for the federal component of that research funding to happen, because it would not be performed by another actor in this space.
So, we're talking about this universe of funding and why it is vital. And you're right? I mean, you never know when that big idea is going to happen. You do the fundamental research and you never know what's going to come out of it. It's one of those things where my alma mater, William and Mary, they have what used to be called the Institute for the Theory and Practice of International Relations. It's now called the Global Research Institute.
Mhm.
And the president of William and Mary, Catherine Rowe, said, you know something, I want the GRI. And the leaders at the GRI said, we want the GRI to be the place to be where if you have thorny, important questions on a global scale, that's where you go to get the answers. That's the kind of fun, and you never know what kind of economic principles, and they do
Mhm.
work on blockchain technology and policy. You never know what's going to come out of these things. This is what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It
Yeah.
really, those components, it's very unpredictable, right? And you never know where the next thing is going to come from, and what it could actually become. So often there are advancements and discoveries made that we truly don't know what the potential is, but it needs more development. But that initial discovery has been made on the campus.
Right. And you have to go down that road. And these are, I mean, let's talk about this. So let's talk about the money that becomes at the outset, the kinds of money that's being spent on this research. What are we talking about in terms of grants? What's the kind of federal outlay that's out there?
Oh gosh, you're quizzing me here.
No, I shouldn't. You know something. You don't need to answer that, but I guess the point
It's
that I want to
billions of dollars. I mean, it is billions of dollars.
But the point that I want to make, it's billions of dollars at the one end, but then it's trillions of dollars in terms of the value of those discoveries down the road.
Yes. Yeah.
And then, but there's also, and let me get to this question now, the important issue of making sure that we are creating the universe of innovators down the road, right? This money is the folks who are doing the foundational work and then turning that foundational work into seminal work of innovation. You have to create a culture of innovation, don't you? Again, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. Talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. You have both components are so important, right? If we don't have the researchers and the future entrepreneurs and the people who can see the potential and want to put in the blood, sweat, and tears and years of further research and development, both at the campus level and then developing it outside of it as a private sector partner, we have to have both of those components, right? We need the PhDs in molecular biology to take things forward, right? Not everyone needs to become an academic, right? We need to have those highly trained, highly skilled, highly educated individuals in the workforce, as well as folks in the business community, right? Entrepreneurship is a huge part of this. Marrying those elements up, having both of those components is extremely important. And without it, we would not be able to maintain our edge and our leadership in having such a great innovation ecosystem in the United States economy. We really wouldn't. I mean, if we lost all of our STEM grads tomorrow, that would have obviously disastrous effects for the United States, not just from the campus research side of things, but also from the workforce element and the entrepreneurship side of things, right? In the further research and development that needs to happen to take it towards commercialization.
I'm smiling because I'm sure you've had these conversations as well. There's nothing quite like having a conversation with someone who has made a discovery that they know can have an impact on the world. They know that they can probably make some money from it too, right? Mm-hmm. The entrepreneurial aspect of it. But talk about those experiences, those kinds of conversations, the excitement that comes from sort of taking those discoveries and making them apply to solve real world problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I have spoken to so many in this space in a host of fields. And the one element when you talk to them is they are so excited and so passionate about it. And you have to have that drive and that passion for what you hope to be a very impactful discovery being brought to global society. You have to have that spark because it is tough work. It's a grind. I mean, just at our recent, the Faces of American Innovation Awards that the Bayh-Dole Coalition gave out, these people were working for 10, 15, 20, 25 years on a single invention, right? A single thing to bring it through. This is a very long, drawn out, deliberate process to bring things to the market and to further commercialization. That's a very long, drawn out process with some stops and starts. And there's no guarantee that there will be a happy ending at the end of it. So you have to have that underlying curiosity and drive and spark. And that is what I see in all of the researchers and inventors and entrepreneurs in this space that I meet in my daily work.
It's
they're incredible.
It's amazing because you and I both know that if you're an academic, and again, I don't mean that in a bad way, but if you're someone who, goes down the road of, you get your undergraduate degree, you get your master's, you decide to go for your doctorate in whatever field, and you have to have your specific field of study in your specific issue area, and you become an expert in some very narrow, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Again, this is not me casting
No, a very specific field,
but very specific. I think you're absolutely right. That's a better way to put it. Very specific area. And then all of a sudden, when you find that there's something within that very specific issue area that can have these life-changing things, I mean, again, it is world-changing for the world. It is world-changing for you as well. And it's got to be, it's got to be gratifying to be working with these folks. And more to the point, the role that you play in safeguarding this. Let's talk about the challenges that are coming, that may be coming. I want to say may, because we're waiting on this, may be coming to Bayh-Dole, maybe with the best of intentions, right? Well, let's not assign motive to these things. But the reality is that there's a fundamental change that is afoot. What does this mean for your members if all of a sudden this idea of march-in, and take a couple of minutes to explain what the march-in provision is and how the proposal that's out there, but explain how that would impact your members.
Yes, absolutely. So the march-in rights under the Bayh-Dole Act is, you can think of it conceptually as kind of an emergency relief valve. I'm sure that my colleagues, Dave and Joe, have talked about this, but in the law, they preserved march-in rights as a way for the government to step in when there was, irresponsible use or non-use, quite frankly, of a subject invention that was derived from federal research dollars. And so what march-in rights allow are the government to come in and say, hey, you're not using this correctly. We are going to license this to another creator, right? Another private sector actor who will then, hopefully produce whatever it is that you've been sitting on. And so that was in an effort to prevent both corporate gamesmanship. Incumbents in the market could easily sit on developing what they view as disruptive technologies that could jeopardize their own market share, and to stop them from being able to sit on an invention like that by taking a license of that technology from a university. And it was also to, if things kind of sputter and flame out with a startup, so that there's a release valve that, like, if this is something that truly goes to an impactful need, the government can identify that and move forward. If for some reason, if there's mismanagement, or if money just runs out, right? If the money just runs out and there's no longer parties that can accept that risk, right? So there's only a few conditions under which march-in can be exercised, and we have lived under those conditions for decades now. The Bayh-Dole Act is coming up on 45 years old next year.
Wow.
And no march-in petition has ever been successful.
Never.
A few. It's never been marched in on. No. The conditions have never been met. Under the march-in rights, there are no provisions that allow for the use of march-in on the basis of price. Many of the petitions that have been filed by individual or organizational actors have asked for the government to march in, the agency that funded that research grant, to march in on the basis that the product is too expensive, whatever it is, right? And that those persons are requesting the government exercise march-in rights in order to have another contractor produce it, in theory, at a lower price, right? That is the ask of those petitions. Those petitions have never been successful, in large part because the law does not allow, it was specifically excluded to be able to march in on the basis of price. And so a shift has occurred over the last 20 years in really focusing on march-in rights as a change in the definition of march-in rights, adding an extra criteria of marching in on reasonable price. This comes from a law review article, I believe in 2004, that gained a lot of traction, specifically in the drug pricing sphere, with stakeholders in that community that saw this as an already existing legal mechanism that the government just needs to exercise on itself, contrary to the fact that it's never been exercised,
right.
but the government just needs to go ahead and exercise it because drug prices are out of control, right? A noble, laudable goal, I think, but focus on this is, and we can go into this. I'm sure you have more questions for me on that.
Oh, yeah.
But going into that changing the conditions of march-in will be hugely detrimental to the academic research enterprise writ large, and not just my members, across all research institutions. Any recipient of federal funding would be impacted by this. I can tell you that the change in those conditions to this really delicate balance that we've had for 44 years, almost 45, would be hugely detrimental on a really large scale, and really misguided, and actually won't achieve the desired policy outcome from those stakeholders.
Plus, I mean, let's be really clear about this. We talked about this with Joe Allen. Like, let's assume we know that this goes far beyond pharmaceuticals, right? But let's look at pharmaceuticals for a second. Your average drug could have, let's say, at least a dozen. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, at least a dozen different patents that are involved in it. Figuring out which was the one that has the federal grant money behind it, that's an issue, right? You've got different institutions that are at work here that may have patented, the various facets of this. You just go and which patent are they going to seize? Are they going to seize all of them? And if you just seize one, I mean, that essentially holds all of the other patent holders hostage to whatever. I mean, it is such a Pandora's box that's going to be opened up. And you and I both know that these regulatory decisions are not supposed to open up these Pandora boxes.
Right.
Is that part of the reason why it's stalled? Is that maybe there wasn't this sort of greater understanding that it's just not so simple as saying, if I want to seize the patent for drug X, I have to actually realize that there may be, many, many more patents that are involved here. And that someone's like, oh my God, I didn't quite realize what we were stepping into. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to speak for those individuals, but it seems that there was a fundamental lack of understanding of how the patents that are tied to subject inventions that have to be disclosed under the Bayh-Dole Act, right? The universities and nonprofits and startups that receive this money and make these discoveries, they have to disclose that to the federal government, right? It's a subject invention. So we know whose patents belong to who and who came from what research grant. We know that, but I think there was a fundamental misunderstanding of how that works in practice, and that pretty much any drug or therapeutic that you're talking about relies on multiple pieces of patenting and intellectual property to get to its actual end state that people see in the market, right? And that can be everything from the delivery mechanism itself to the compounds to the vaccine platform on which the targeted vaccine, for lack of a better word, lies upon, right? Yeah. So I think there was a fundamental misunderstanding that this was not a one and done. You would have to seize all of the patents to be able to then license it to a new contractor. And so, there was a total misunderstanding. And I think this is one where, people really put the cart before the horse.
This gets into something else. And you've got a master's. Is it a joint master's and a joint MPA and MPP?
Yeah.
So you got a joint MPA, MPP, you got a law degree, you got a JD. I mean, one of the things that gets me is this is hard stuff. There are never any easy answers when it comes to public policy problems. There are never any silver bullets there. And if anybody tells you that there's a silver bullet solution to something, they're lying to you. Yes. I mean, this is one of those situations where, this is why, and this gets into a whole different question out of left field. Just bear with me for a second. Mm-hmm. Sure. But you're involved in government affairs, so you know this. There's a reason why this is a deliberative process. It's not supposed to be shortchanged. Talk about that, and given your background, why it's important to deliberate these, or that this is an example of why it's important to deliberate things.
Right. So I assume we're talking about the framework itself.
Yeah. Right.
So the framework that came out last December, that I'm sure your other guests have talked about, this presents a really, it's a mess on a regulatory and public policy, standpoint. If I can use a professional term, it's a hot mess, right? Yeah.
Term of art, love it.
Right, a term of art, right? Yeah. creating this as draft guidance to agencies, in my legal opinion, and those shared of others, was a deliberate choice by those who favor this policy to evade the normal legal mechanisms
Right.
of both intra-government review as well as potential
Right.
litigation challenges under the APA, right? Making these kinds of changes to any federal regulation,
Right.
let alone a landmark piece of legislation and an entire regulatory schematic that has been promulgated following its passage in 1980, trying to upend that in the form of draft guidance is a way to evade review.
Yes.
It's a way for one component of an administration to attempt to achieve political outcomes and political ends without receiving the normal intergovernmental agency review of those affected and centralized, for example, in the Office of Legal Counsel and OIRA at OMB.
Yeah, this is the essence of what, we've had him on a couple of times. My colleague Wayne Cruz calls regulatory dark matter. And the whole point is, listen, love or hate the Chevron decision, love or hate the Loper decision, love or hate West Virginia versus EPA. The point is, in the end, these processes exist to protect individual rights, and you can't circumvent them, right? The whole issue of the major questions doctrine gets at this issue. You can't upend entire sectors of the economy based on small bits of language within the law. For the go down the road of do this as draft guidance, which, we could, again, not to get political, but this is why, folks were looking very carefully at the issues of the impact that guidance has here. But you got to want it. Listen, because I know your time's valuable here. Obviously it is. Let's sort of talk a little bit about background. How did you get involved in this? Did you ever think you were going to be doing this kind of work? How did you make this progression?
It's been really interesting. Being an active duty military spouse obviously has had a pretty dramatic effect on my career.
Something that I share. Yeah.
Yes, it's something we have in common.
Yeah.
I have been very fortunate to, to be able to, even though we moved around quite a bit earlier in my spouse's career, we were able to kind of stabilize in 2015. And that's when I went into federal government service. Nice. And I really I moved from representing individual clients in multiple states to now representing federal agencies and acting as their legal counsel, which was a big pivot.
Sure.
I really enjoyed both being a litigator, a frontline litigator, but also the policy and regulatory aspects of it, how that sausage, how that dark matter, how that sausage is made, right? And seeing the agency through those processes to both comply with the regulations and the statutes that are part of their mission, but also to continue to enforce that compliance and to help them work through new policy developments as those came down, either from Congress or through executive orders with the White House. And so, I spent about almost 7 years in government and advising, and I had, working in an office of general counsel, you're very much in the background. You are the man behind the curtain, right?
Sure.
Like advising and pushing forward. And I really wanted to make a different kind of impact. And I also wanted to leave litigation. So those two components combined, I started looking about what kind of other opportunities there were. And I was fortunate to leverage my network and meet people who knew me and who knew what my strengths were. I asked a lot of my friends and they said, you make a pretty great government relations advocate.
Sure.
And so I ended up here and went through their processes, and now I've been here for about 2.5 years.
There you go. So let's talk about this. Because I want to talk about some of your other outside interests in a second. Let's talk about the military spouse. So I realize it's the Military Spouse JD Network.
Yes.
I had no idea that was even there. Talk about that's all with some of your other volunteer work that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So MSJDN is a virtual bar association for lawyers, and now law students as well. Anyone who is either attached through marriage or even a girlfriend or a boyfriend to a service member, be that active reserve, guard, or retired, right? And so this is an amazing community that is 10 years old now, founded by a couple of military spouse attorneys who realized they got stationed in other states from where their bar licenses were and knew they weren't going to be there very long and wanted to have careers and wanted to be able to work and contribute to their community, but were kind of blocked by the licensing requirements.
Sure.
Of their respective state bars. And so these women that came together at the beginning worked together to lobby individually at state levels to change those rules to accommodate military spouses who have their bar licenses and want to practice, but they're not going to be in your state very long.
Right.
And so what can they do while they're here? And so there are accommodations, I believe, in 44 states and the U.S. Virgin Islands now as a result of MSJDN's incredible work.
Wait, time out. So 10 years, 44 states and at least one territory. That is a huge accomplishment.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow.
It's an absolute powerhouse of an organization. And now that we've reached that number, there are a lot of talk about our continuing mission, right? We're going to reach the end at some point.
Sure.
So there have also been discussions about MSJDN. We do a lot of workforce development and professional development of military spouses in the legal field writ large, and also act as a really key stakeholder in the larger military nonprofit space as well.
It's so funny because you were the folks I should have turned to when I was pitching battles against the Defense Health Agency over the implementation of MHS Genesis, Military Health System.
Oh my
Genesis
gosh,
system.
Genesis.
No. That's not that I want to get
podcast just on Genesis.
I know, but that's my point. If I'd known about you, I would have contacted you. I'm like, hey, you need to help me with this. I am going to digress for a second because I'll tell you the funny story. Because we got a call. One of our kids was signing up for MHS Genesis, and they wanted her credit card information to do a soft background check. And we're like, no, this is not kosher. The DOD will never ask.
Never ask for that.
But it was true. That was the thing. And anyway, so it's a whole thing that anyway, not to digress on this. So let me ask you before I let you go. If I hadn't done this podcast, still may do it. I had wanted to do a podcast called Outside Interest, talking to folks in the public policy and political world about the stuff that they do that is not related to their jobs. Now, obviously, because the idea came up because somebody I knew had become a photographer, and two other folks played in blues bands. So when you're not doing this work, what are you up to? How are you spending your time? What are your outside interests?
Oh, you mean when I'm not operating on a hectic congressional calendar?
Yes, of course. Well, listen, we all got to have something that's soul affirming. But yes.
Well, I'm a tried and true soccer mom out in the DC burbs. But I actually I'm a crafter. Like I paint and I embroider. But I also really enjoy volunteer work. I've been a long time volunteer, both with MSJDN and other nonprofits. I also volunteer. When I was a Fed, I participated in the DOJ Volunteer Lawyers Project, and I represented throughout my almost 7 years in government, represented a number of low-income clients in Washington, D.C. in landlord-tenant court.
Fantastic.
Helped preserve their housing, helped maintain residences to keep them from becoming homeless.
Nice.
And I was proud to do that through the pandemic as well, because that was a very hectic time. In landlord-tenant court.
Yeah,
so,
I don't doubt it.
I loved doing that, and I also was a volunteer with the Whitman Walker Clinic here in DC, and I provide assistance doing administrative name changes for transgender men and women in the District of Columbia.
There you go.
Doing those administrative changes really helps them set off on a new trajectory and helps them in so many different contexts, like employment, securing benefits, housing. Right, having the name that matches makes a huge difference for them.
Absolutely. Well, listen, Kate, thank you so very much for joining us today. Really appreciate. How do folks find out more about the good work you're doing at the Association of American Universities?
Yeah, absolutely. Go to aau.edu, sign up for our newsletter. We put out every other week, I believe. The Leading Research Universities newsletter is great. You can learn all about different types of research that are happening on our campuses, and you can also see our advocacy issues and find out what we're doing on the Hill.
Well, there you go. Our guest has been Kate Hudson with the Association of American Universities. This, of course, brings us to the close of yet another lunch hour. If you're watching us on YouTube, check us out on one of the many fine podcast platforms. Take us with you when you're out and about. If you're listening to us, come and check out our YouTube page. Please subscribe and let everybody you know how much you love the podcast. I'm Andrew Langer, your host. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.